From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power.
From the Democratic National Convention in Chicago to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power alongside Kaylee Lines. I'm Joe Matthew. Kaylee, you've made it to Chicago. Indeed. A month after the Republicans wrapped their convention in Milwaukee. It's day one here in Chicago, and we've got some great guests and important voices teed up for the next 2 hours to get us ready, Kaylee, for the first night.
Indeed, it's going to be a big one. It also comes a month after President Joe Biden left this race, decided not to seek re-election and hand the reins over to his Vice President Kamala Harris, who already is officially the Democratic nominee after a virtual roll call earlier this month.
Yes, indeed.
But the formalities and the pomp and circumstance happen here in Chicago this week. And of course, she will wrap things up, giving that acceptance speech on Thursday. It is President Biden we will hear from in prime time tonight. That's the big one. President Biden here in town. The First Lady Jill Biden will also be speaking. And the theme, Kaylee, we've got, of course, a different theme for each night. For the people, which is right up Joe Biden's alley when it comes to his own branding. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton will also be at the podium tonight as well. Yeah, many speeches to watch. We're also, of course, watching here in Chicago for potential protests. We've already seen some yesterday. And the question is going to be, to what extent could they actually disrupt the activities today? Obviously, much preparation has been done from a security standpoint. And of course, Democrats are really going to be trying to project a message of unity, even if there are some divisions evident over the ongoing war. Yeah, we're talking tens of thousands, potentially, we've heard at least, of protesters. We saw some gatherings last night around Michigan Avenue and some other areas close to where we're all staying, but unclear the scale to which these protests will take. We know there are 30 uncommitted delegates on the floor, pro-Palestinian delegates, ceasefire delegates, as they've been called. But the logistics, the security surrounding this event couldn't be more complicated. And that's where we start our conversation with Bloomberg's Isis Almeida, who is our Chicago bureau chief here at Bloomberg. Isis, great to see you. Thanks for having us in your hometown.
Thank you for having me.
This has been quite the operation to secure this convention. What are we in for the next several days?
Yes, I think the city's been preparing for like over a year. Chicago police is getting help from about 500 police officers from other parts of the country too. I think there's 150 National Guard on standby. Pritzker confirmed that yesterday, just in case we need it. We've seen the first protests. There's at least 7 scheduled that we know of, and I'm sure many more will come and pop up once in a while. And you know, it will just be interesting to see how they can disrupt the mood or how the city of Chicago keeps everyone under control. Well, and it's been especially remarkable because the city of Chicago has hosted a convention before, including in 1968. And that's what everyone seems to be drawing a comparison to as we come in to this week. But obviously, Chicago very much wanted to host this. This was a big effort on the part of Governor Pritzker, who you just mentioned. What does this mean for the city, especially if things potentially go awry or we start to actually see protests turning violent? Yes, I think for the governor, really, this convention is what propels him to the national stage, right? If you think about, like, a lot of people don't know who he is, and I think after this week, everyone will know who he is. So keeping things under control and making sure that we don't look like 1968, where we had severe clashes between the police and protesters, and the police pretty much crushed the protesters. I think that will be very, very important for the governor and his image. So I think they will try everything they can to ensure that things go peacefully.
Interesting that we've heard from police on that front that even non-permitted protesters will not be rounded up, will not be arrested as they try to avoid massive engagements with protesters. We're not going to see hundreds or thousands of people rounded up. Is that fair to say?
I think if things remain peaceful, I definitely think we won't see that. But I think Chief Snelling, who is our chief of police here in Chicago, he made it clear he will not let protesters destroy the city. And of course, it's not just going to be protesters that are here in town. There's thousands of people who have descended for the convention. Obviously, this is a big event for a city hosting. What kind of economic impact do we expect that this is going to have for Chicago? I think this is a really interesting question because the economic impact that has been forecast is about 150 to 200 million. But when you start talking to restaurants and you see that maybe the number of like Chicago residents that have chosen to stay away from the city are actually impacting their reservations. So they're not really seeing a boom in restaurant bookings as a result. It was funny when I drove in today, there was no traffic. And I was like, wow, this is the first day of, in weeks that there's no traffic on the highway.
Not too used to that around here, but that is what this is all about, right? There's a reason why a city vies for an opportunity like this to get the eyes of the nation, get the eyes of the world on Chicago, and maybe change the narrative. Donald Trump spent time in Milwaukee comparing Chicago to Afghanistan, referring to some of the crime statistics. This is a chance for Chicago to turn that story around, right?
Yeah, I think Chicago, even before the convention, already had issues with like persistently high crime. We've seen some high-profile businesses leaving the city, and I think that has really created that national narrative and the way people perceive Chicago. So I think it's a chance for the city to try to turn that around, and it will be important for them to keep things under control. But I think long term, the city needs to continue to tackle crime if it is to attract businesses here.
Well, and tackling crime is obviously something that presidential candidates are talking about as well. Certainly, Kamala Harris has been attacked by Donald Trump on the crime issue in addition to the economy and the border. Can you just give us a sense, Isis? Obviously, we are sitting here in a deep blue state. This is not a swing state where this convention is being held, as was the case in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But what are the issues that resonate with voters, not just in Chicago, but in Illinois in general?
Yeah, I think the biggest concerns that we see here, we see the pro-Palestine concerns, and this is why you have the protests. You see a lot of like women's rights, reproductive rights, LGBTQ plus rights, and that is something that a lot of people in the state are concerned about. I think the migration issue too, immigration, and you've seen the number of like people, more than 40,000 people have arrived in Chicago from Texas and other parts of the country bused here, and I think there's a lot of tension between the Chicagoan Black population and the immigrants that are coming, and where the city spends its resources. And, there's a lot of money that's gone to sheltering the migrants while there's already a Black homeless population in the city. So those are tensions that we've seen played out in City Hall.
All right, Isis Almeida, it's going to be a busy week for you playing host to all of us this week. She is our Chicago bureau chief. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, Joe and I are now here in Chicago. Both President Biden and Kamala Harris are now here as well, although Biden is going to be leaving after his speech tonight, heading out to California. He won't be staying through the week. But we also saw the presidential candidates, including Vice President Harris, on the move this weekend as they competed in swing states. Harris and Walz on a bus tour of Pennsylvania yesterday. And of course, Donald Trump holding some rallies of his own. Yeah, not an accident where they're positioning themselves. And we're going to see actually Donald Trump and J.D. Vance kind of counter-programming what Democrats are doing throughout the week. Not exactly what we saw in Milwaukee, but this is what they're dealing with right now, with new polls showing once again that Kamala Harris has the momentum. And you can't stay home if you're Donald Trump. Yeah, definitely trying to stall that momentum to the extent that he can. But we should just take a listen to some of the language we were hearing from both of these candidates this weekend as they looked ahead to this week.
I very much consider us the underdog. We have a lot of work to do to earn the vote of the American people. That's why we're on this bus tour today, and we're going to be traveling this country as we've been and talking with folks, listening to folks, and hopefully earning their votes over the next 79 days.
Who would believe this? 80 days from now, we are going to defeat a communist known as Kamala Harris. She's a communist. Most radical left person ever to run for office. This is not what this country needs. We've had enough of them. We're going to win back the White House, and we're going to take back our country.
Anybody who's about beating down other people is a coward. This is what strength looks like. So we know what we are about. We know what we stand for. And one of the beautiful things about these next 79 days is what the people in this room have already been doing and know. Let's build community. Let's reinforce community.
I'm a better looking person than Kamala. No, I couldn't believe it. She said, I had never heard that one. They said, no, her biggest advantage is that she's a beautiful woman. I'm going, I never thought of that. I'm better looking than she is.
So So that was a look back at this past weekend. Now we look forward to what's to come for the remainder of the week here at the Democratic National Convention. And as we do so, joining us here on set in Chicago is Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger of Virginia. Congresswoman, thank you so much for being with us. Happy convention week to you. Obviously, you and your party are coming into this week with, I think, can be fairly characterized as a great deal of enthusiasm over the new candidate 4 weeks into her campaign. The question has been, how does that momentum be sustained after this week? What does the party need to do in the coming days here in Chicago to keep this going until the election?
Well, I think importantly, what we're doing back home in Virginia is making a pitch to voters about what's on the line with this election, what matters, why people need to get out and vote. And what I expect to occur is coming out of this convention, the continued conversation about the stakes of this election, the choice that we have certainly at the presidential and vice presidential level, but even at the Senate level. In Virginia, we have Senator Tim Kaine up for re-election, and at the congressional level, where we have some incumbents running for re-election as well as some challengers. And so that momentum, I think, will continue. We've had more than a 500% increase in volunteer signups back home in the Commonwealth. So it's an exciting time, but it's because people know what's at stake.
Each member of the party, certainly every lawmaker coming to town here, is coming with a different set of issues, a different set of values, you might suggest. And in Virginia, it's interesting, as you butt up against the capital city, you have a massive federal workforce.
That's right.
Working in your state, whose jobs could be on the line depending on the outcome of this election.
That's exactly right. And we have seen through Agenda 2025, through Agenda 47, or Project 2025 and Agenda 47, we know that there are major shifts that President Trump and a Vice President Vance would make to the federal workforce. Vance himself said that his advice would be to fire every federal worker and replace them with, quote, our people. So the stakes of this election are dire for so many Virginians, and certainly the federal workforce, the very function of government, but the Virginia economy. And so it's something that we're talking about across the Commonwealth, the reality that when you have a presidential and vice presidential candidate who wants to do away with those jobs, those livelihoods, that's a major risk, certainly to those individuals, to their lives, to their jobs, but also to our economy.
Well, certainly we've all paid attention to what Trump and the Trump-Vance ticket broadly have outlined in terms of what they'd like to see with their domestic agenda. There's also the foreign policy agenda. We know, for example, Senator Vance is highly skeptical of continuing to help fund Ukraine and its effort against Russia. Certainly there is some contrast between these two tickets when it comes to the issue of Israel and Gaza, something we expect to be fully on display here in Chicago with protests. Given your seat on the Intelligence Committee, your background at the CIA, how should we be thinking about the foreign policy implications of this election?
The foreign policy implications of this election are extraordinary. And I say that as a current member of Congress, as you mentioned, a member of the Intelligence Committee, but also as a former national security professional, as a CIA officer. The things that J.D. Vance has said about our support to the Ukrainians, I think just discounts the entire importance and value of American global leadership, of our commitment to our NATO allies. Certainly we saw under President Trump's first presidential term his constant alienating of our allies, his efforts to pull us away from NATO, which is an extraordinarily important alliance. And the contrast is clear, and a Trump-Vance administration would imperil our national security, would imperil our position of global leadership, and from a national security perspective, I think would be a dire circumstance, particularly as we see on the ground in Ukraine, the Ukrainians fighting for their freedom, and we see commitment to the cause of democracy worldwide under threat.
Remember the race in 2008? Hillary Clinton famously had the 3 a.m. call ad. You know, is your commander-in-chief going to be ready when the phone rings at 3 a.m.? She was referring to her experience at the time, and of course then became Secretary of State in another career. When we consider the stakes in this election, after everything that you just said, why is Kamala Harris ready for that phone call at 3 a.m.? What experience brings her to that point?
Well, importantly, she spent time as a member of the United States Senate on the Senate Intelligence Committee. So recognizing the breadth and the scope of information coming in from the intelligence community, from the extraordinary individuals working the world over to help policymakers make informed decisions. I'm proud I used to be one of those folks, and now I'm on the policymaking side. So in that role, she knows the full scope of what comes before policymakers. As vice president, she has had a seat in the room at every major decision, whether it was sharing initial intelligence related to our knowledge that the Russians were going to invade Ukraine, or anything across the board. Since that war began, she has been part of the decisions being made. She has been in the room, and she knows the reality and the dire consequences of each situation and what the American response needs to be and has been.
And finally, Congresswoman, before we let you go, this election also will, of course, mark the last one you are in as a sitting member of Congress. You are not seeking re-election to that body, instead pursuing the governor of Virginia. Before you go, though, knowing we're going to be in full election cycle mode, maybe not a lot's going to happen between now, maybe the lame duck session. I know there's some things you want to get done, including the Stock Act, restrictions on trading for members. Are you confident you can get that done before you leave the chamber?
Oh, so it's a busy time on Capitol Hill.
Sure.
And the Trust in Congress Act, which is the one that would put restrictions on members of Congress from being able to buy or sell individual stocks, right, is so vitally important, because when we think over the past number of years, the degradation of trust that people have had, the low approval rating of Congress, our ability to say, when we are here, every decision we make is a decision we are making because it is one that is informed by information, by intelligence, by conversations we're having with experts in certain fields, and not by how we might benefit or our stock portfolio might benefit. In terms of how confident I am, the bill is wholly bipartisan. We've got folks across the political spectrum supporting it because it just makes sense. It's wildly popular with the American people. And I ultimately will continue to push for Speaker Johnson to bring that bill for a vote. But I am tempering my enthusiasm on our ability to get it through, but I will say that I have already lined up my successor to carry it on. If we do not get it this Congress, I promise you we will continue to have an aggressive effort to get it done.
And it would stand a better chance in a Democratic House?
I would hope so.
Okay. Congresswoman, great to see you in Chicago. Thanks for starting your day with us here on Bloomberg. Abigail Spanberger of Virginia. As we get things started here, special coverage from Chicago. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines. It's day one of the Democratic National Convention. And Kaylee, coming up, will sit down with a local. Congressman Jonathan Jackson of Illinois will be with us right here on set to carry on our conversation.
Indeed, we're looking forward to that one, and we have much more coming up throughout the course of the next several hours here on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from the DNC in Chicago. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. I'm Kaylee Lines alongside Joe Matthew as the DNC week kicks off. Of course, 4 days, 4 nights, Joe, of pomp and circumstance, enthusiasm in the Democratic Party. And it begins tonight with a primetime speech from President Joe Biden, who, of course, just 4 weeks ago decided this would not be his convention. Instead, it's the convention of his vice president, Kamala Harris.
That's right. He's the headliner instead of on the fourth night. On the first night, First Lady Jill Biden will be speaking as well. Kaylee, there's been a lot of references to passing the baton, and that's actually what is going to happen. We saw Kamala Harris and Joe Biden on stage for the first time last week, as we brought to our listeners and viewers live for the first time since Joe Biden dropped out. But this is the big moment tonight, as he looks ahead to the future in a theme for the people on night one of the DNC. And joining us now is Congressman Jonathan Jackson of Illinois. We thought we'd bring someone actually from Chicago. It's great to see you, sir. Thanks for being here at the table. Nice to see you in your hometown.
Great to see you again.
Is this a good night or a bad night for Joe Biden?
It's a great night. President Biden has so much to be proud of. He's honored his word to the African-American community. He was the first president to actually interview an African-American woman to go to the Supreme Court. He's put an African-American woman on the Supreme Court. He also had an African-American as his vice president, and he has now made her his successor that he has endorsed. President Joe Biden has fully funded the EPA. He's done something record and historic in putting money into human infrastructure. The city of Chicago on the south and west sides has the largest amount of lead service lines in the nation. There is no safe amount of lead that you can have in your water. That's fully funded. So he's done so many remarkable things, and I think that that's going to be a hallmark of his legacy and the foundation that he's laid for a future generation.
Well, Congressman, you talk about ways in which he has elevated Black Americans to some of the most senior levels of the U.S. government across all of its branches. Yet what we saw was in his candidacy, at least this time around, he was struggling to galvanize that base of voters that had supported him in 2020. We're starting to see that change, at least polling indicates, with Vice President Harris. What do you expect that her candidacy is going to be able to do when it comes to Black voters or just voters of color in general in this election? How have things changed over the last 4 weeks?
Well, I think that earlier, I believe there was a bit of fake news and people saying African-American men were looking at Donald Trump. Donald Trump is entertaining. He's like P.T. Barnum, so you'll listen to him, you'll cackle with him, but you don't take anything serious about him. African-American males know this is the same man that asked for the death, the execution of the Central Park 5 young teenagers, and after they were found guilty, he still has not apologized to them. Like, something is very depraved about this man. This man was also accusing a victim of sexual assault. That we know better than that. But what Mr. Biden has done is offered a clear alternative. He asked for decency. He has restored that. And now what you see in Mrs. Harris, she knows the culture. She's been a part of it. She's a product. She's gone to a historically Black college. She has made clear on her investments that she wants to make in the community, and she has galvanized it. We see continuity. We see legacy. We see tradition. And for that, we want to honor her and keep up the great work of the Biden-Harris administration.
Yet Congressman Donald Trump continues to question Kamala Harris's racial identity, suggesting that she's somehow not actually part of the Black community. What do you say to that?
Well, that's very much ignorant that he should first look at American law. 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson, there was a test on that, and it came out to say that if you have one drop of blood, you're the Negro by definition. It's the Negro rule. So he's very ignorant of a lot of things, and that's one thing that he should be ashamed of. She has, her father is of African descent. He's Jamaican. Her mother is of Indian descent. Like, I don't know what this guy gets off on, and nobody ever pushes back on him for the most outrageous thing that he says. Let's talk about something else he said. He says he's beautiful when he was out at the Mar-a-Lago Rim.
Yeah,
he
better
says,
looking than she is.
He says that he's better looking than Vice President Harris. Who would ever believe that, okay? We should at least give the man a dog so that the dog can have an objective test. Like, nobody's ever called this man attractive. And from his behavior with women, he's been very aggressive. So, no, there's something fundamentally wrong. What man compares himself beauty-wise to a female? I think he's very misogynistic. You're going to see racism come out. As he gets ready for this debate on September 10th, he's going to have looming over his head a September 18th trial date, if you will, a sentencing date. He's under enormous pressure at 80 years of age for things that he's done. And I think all of this is going to make him have even more erratic behavior.
Well, certainly we have seen a great number of personal attacks from Trump against Kamala Harris, but we also have seen some more targeted attacks when it comes to specific issues like the border or the economy. He has been, along with J.D. Vance, suggesting that if she was really going to do something to be able to fight inflation on day one, her day one was 3.5 years ago. We've heard this repeatedly now. What is the answer to that? Why has she not been able to have more influence over that as vice president?
Well, I don't have the answer for that at this moment, but it's a very complex issue. One thing you have to do is stop what he was gearing up for on this massive deportation. That's inhumane. That's not who we are. And then his outrageous idea of building this border wall. That also hurts the ecosystem. Animals and other things have to go around there. Winds and birds have to go over there. What is ailing South America should be the question that he should be focused on. President Trump is a chronic complainer, whiner. As opposed to fixing the blame, he ought to be more mature and fix the problem. The problem is not at the Mexican border. The problem is in South and Central America. When we end up putting additional sanctions on Cuba, saying that they're a terrorist state where there is no credible evidence for that, that drove 500,000 people off of the island that then have to migrate. When they put additional sanctions on Venezuela, that took out another 3 to 5 million people that they had to migrate. So people are coming up the Pan American corridor to the city of Chicago. It's 2,499 miles from Caracas, Venezuela to Chicago, Illinois. You don't have to fly to Caracas, Venezuela. You don't have to take a boat to Caracas, Venezuela. People are walking up that corridor because we put sanctions. We need to normalize some of the relationships, not be so punitive. It is growing. 2/3 of our hemisphere is non-English speaking. They're in South America. They're poor, and they're trying to have economic stability. The new era of America should be looking at something fundamentally that transforms our Marshall Plan, where we're helping these countries invest in their water systems, helping them invest in their roadway. That's something America has proprietary technology in, and we can make and expand our markets. Same thing we did after World War II when we went into Europe. We can have that same formula, and do that in South and Central America and in Africa. I want to put Africa on there just for a moment because in the year 2050, just 25 years from now, which is something we should be talking about, in 25 years from now, 1 in 4 persons on planet Earth will be Africans. How are we aligning our interests and our future towards what's going to be 25% of the world's population?
Congressman, the border is a huge issue. So is the economy. We've talked a lot about inflation. We've talked a lot about the plans that we've at least been able to understand. I know that we need some details from both campaigns. But one of your most passionate issues has been expanding the child tax credit on Capitol Hill. That is something that Kamala Harris wants to expand to $6,000, the number we hear. But J.D. Vance is also calling for an expanded child tax credit. Do you worry that Democrats in Chicago vote for the Trump-Vance ticket because of what they're talking about here, what are essentially Democratic issues? No, because what Mrs. Harris is doing is authentic. What J.D. Vance is doing is following. He's not leading the issue. Yeah. The second part, what J.D. Vance is doing, he doesn't think that every woman should have an equal right to vote. He thinks that women that have more children should have a higher level of righting to vote versus women that have fewer votes. We've already been through that with African Americans being called 3/5 of a human being who should have which level of proportionality to vote. His ideas are antiquated, they're stale, they simply don't work. Mrs. Harris is an authentic description of a child tax credit. That which was passed by Congresswoman De Rosario ended up moving 500,000, 50% of our children out of poverty. It never should have been cut under the Trump administration.
I'd like to ask you as well, Congressman, because we are here in your hometown. There has been a lot of talk about 1968, also in Chicago. I think we all know how that went at a convention. And there are planned protests here for basically the duration of this week over the war Israel is still conducting against Hamas in Gaza. How concerned are you that we may see images like we saw 60 years ago, almost?
I don't think we'll see that. I think we have a mayor that came out of the organizing community and activist. He and I have been on many marches and demonstrations together. I'm glad that he's opened the city hall, the mayor's office, to talk to them. There are routes that are established in very high visible levels. So I am glad that he has opened the door. He's talked to them. He's not shunned them. He's not turned his back on them. And I also encourage demonstrations. I think it's a healthy part of our democracy. Young people are out there. They have a point of view. They're trying to build a future for their future together. And to the degree they raise their voice peacefully, that's a good thing. Unlike what you saw with Mr. Donald J. Trump going into the Capitol, not wanting to have a clear transfer of power and killing Officer Sicknick, and not having the decency to call Officer Sicknick's name, not having the decency to call the officers on Capitol Hill and apologize for those that have lost their lives and others that have committed suicide and others that have been beaten down. He's shown no respect. And now all the way up until the time of the Congressional Gold Medal, saying it doesn't have any merit, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. They're comparable medals. Something's wrong with the man. As he gets more desperate, as he sees the polling number goes away, he's concerned that somebody's called him well. Well, you are weird. You never laugh. You wake up mad all day long. You probably sleep with a Finch cliff, you know, a clenched fist. Something is fundamentally wrong with this man.
You're bringing a lot today, Congressman. The protesters outside are one thing. What do you tell the 30 or so delegates, I know it's not a very high number, who are calling themselves ceasefire delegates, who want to try to disrupt the proceedings on the floor of this convention?
I wouldn't know if they would be disruptors, but if they are dissenters and want to maintain that position, I can respect it. It's going to be over 2,000 delegates if 30 people that have applied and gotten on, and this is their petition. I think our 10 is big enough to hold together. Even you have never Trumpers. Some of them came around, and some of them have not come around. We've got some Republicans.
Some of them are here.
And some of those never Trumpers are here. So it'll never be a party that has everyone singing at the same page at the same time. But out of that, I respect their creativity and their differences, even if I don't necessarily agree with it.
Surely there is a right to freedom of speech in this country. There's also a right, of course, to freedom of the press, something Joe and I enjoy very much. We get to interview people like you. We have not yet, though, and many people haven't, had the pleasure of interviewing the vice president since she became the Democratic nominee. This is something that the Trump-Vance campaign is criticizing her heavily for. Is it time for her to do that? Should she be answering questions from the press? Should she be doing a sit-down interview, or is just doing these rallies and reading the teleprompter and giving the speech in Chicago this week?
Well, I think she's done so much more than that. She had a body of work that's very well recognized, and that was with the Biden-Harris administration. This was unprecedented in that the president decided to step out. First thing she had to do was go through all the mechanics and the legal work to transfer documents to be the nominee. Then she had to gather all the votes to secure the nomination. Same time, she had to vet out a vice president. They had to map out a strategy, get ready to culminate at the convention. Then I believe it's the time for her to articulate all of her positions. But right now, she's very much in sync with the Biden-Harris administration. There will be some changes, but fundamentally, she has a great platform. It'll have some more of her personality, but she has a great platform to run on.
That timeline you mentioned will culminate with a debate on September 10th. Will that debate decide the outcome of this election?
No, I don't think so. I expect this to get much more dirty, nastier, all that coming from Trump. He's talking about attacks. He's not talking about the agenda that he wants to go forward. He's painting this very morose and dark cloud. We're going to have the 1929, you're going back into the Great Depression. If I don't win, every time the market goes up, it's because of me. Anytime it went down, it's because of him. He's just blamed, and I think people are tired of his pettiness. They're tired of his whining. People want to go forward with a vision. I think America is much better than that, and I'm so excited. When I see women standing up, when I see Mr. Walsh coming from being a teacher and a coach, these are people that we recognize. Not all the power and people have to go to the most prestigious and elite schools. There are great American schools all over the country. This reaffirms that wherever you go, you get a good education, you can rise up to the highest levels of our office and lead the American people.
All right, Congressman, great to see you here in Chicago. Thank you so much for having us
Thank you.
in town. Congressman Jonathan Jackson of Illinois, we appreciate your time, sir, joining us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. And of course, we have much more conversation about the convention and the state of the 2024 race still ahead. But as always here on Bloomberg, we also have to keep tabs on the financial markets. So let's get a check on that now with Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle in New York. Hey, Abby.
Hey, Kaylee and Joe. Well, it's interesting because we have stocks trading higher at this point, really at session highs after what had felt like a pretty sleepy session overnight. The S&P 500 E-mini futures basically up a little, down a little. Now, though, we do have the S&P 500 up closer to 0.5%, so a very solid gain, and very interesting, up an 8th day in a row, the longest winning streak going back to November of last year. So the best streak for stocks of this year after that bit of a sell-off. Now, beneath the surface, though, the volume is anemic, 30% below a recent average. That tells you that investors are still contending with a lot. One of them, of course, being uncertainty around election 2024. Another being the yen carry trade. We've heard so much about the unwind of the yen carry trade, whether there's more to go. Earlier today, the yen had been very strong, up more than 1%, which means that cheap money trade goes away. Now the yen off of those highs. We also have bonds rallying a little bit, which means yields are lower. That helps stocks. But at the end of the day, of course, it is DNC week. And I think Joe and Kaylee, I finally put together a Harris trade because, of course, she outlined some policy last week. And this has to do with the idea that she's interested in perhaps capping grocery prices. So on the back of this, we do have Kroger lower, down 0.4%. At this point, Albertsons is a little bit higher. But also really interesting is the idea that she wants to create a $25,000 tax subsidy or subsidy for first-time home buyers. Meritage and D.H. Horton, those are home builders that really cater to first-time or new home builders. Those stocks up sharply. So the Harris trade, I would say, mainly today, really getting quite a lift.
Our campaign manager was mad.
Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle. Thank you so much, Abigail, for keeping tabs on the markets for us as we conduct our business here in Chicago, talking politics as usual, but a special brand. It's the DNC, a month after the RNC brought us to Milwaukee. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines here in Chicago as we assemble our panel as well. Rick Davis, partner at Stonecourt Capital, is with us. Jeanne Zaino, political science professor at Iona University, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. We made it, everybody. Nice to see you here for yet another convention. Jeanne, we just heard from Abigail Spanberger, Jonathan Jackson. This is a party very excited to be in this moment right now because it feels a lot different than it did a month ago.
It does. Somebody said this was going to be a wake, and now it is, to your point, Mardi Gras or a party. So I think that aptly, briefly describes how many Democrats feel. And, you know, there is a lot of work to be done here, but this is for the party a new generation, and it's something that they have wanted to put forward, and people on the ground are feeling good. But the polls are still close, so a lot of work to do.
I'm so glad you bring up polls, Jeanne, because that's exactly what I wanted to ask about. And I know before I say this that Rick is going to say it's a national poll, it doesn't count. But ABC, Washington Post, Ipsos, Harris 49, Trump 45, 4-point spread. Yes, this is national. We're dealing with a pretty wide margin of error here. But when you put that together with other polls that we have seen in swing states especially, it does look like Harris comes into this week with the wind at her back.
Yeah, I will concede that polling, especially national polling, can serve as a sort of a guide as to where things are going. It's a directional signal. And there's no question that the directional signals for Harris are all up, right? And whether it's tied or she's a little bit ahead, I think it's, you know, irrelevant right now, but clearly she's got momentum. She's got a week ahead of her where she gets to control the evening news. She gets to control the social media that's flowing out of here. And it should be another really good week for her. And I would say she hasn't lost a media cycle since she was announced as a presidential candidate. And that is extraordinary, to dominate the media against Donald Trump, who is a dominant media candidate. And so this is going to be a good week for her.
Pretty remarkable when you look inside this poll as well. The number on independents improving over Joe Biden. Independents supporting Kamala Harris by 8 points compared to just 2 for Joe Biden a month ago. Isn't that the story that she needs to be telling?
It is. And first of all, Kaylee, congratulations on getting him to concede about the national polls. We got to mark that. But it absolutely is. I mean, this is what they are working towards. One thing the Democrats have to be very careful about in this convention, and I think that they're cognizant of this, is that it doesn't become an Acela Corridor convention where you have big Hollywood stars and people. I love the Acela Corridor myself. I live on it. But it's got to be about these independents, moderates in these swing states. So that's why we saw them yesterday in Pennsylvania. They're going to Wisconsin this week. And, of course, Trump and Vance are spending a lot of time on the road as well, because everybody knows that this is about winning those independents. And the independents are feeling much better about saying, yeah, you know what, I'm going to look at Harris and I'm going to look at Waltz, because they weren't saying that when it was Joe Biden at the head of this race.
This is the last question I'll ask about this poll, at least for now. While it does have some good signs for Harris in it, on the economy and inflation, Trump is still leading her by 9 points in terms of who voters actually trust. She, of course, unveiled her economic platform in North Carolina on Friday, at least the broad strokes of it. We still have a lot of specifics I think us here at Bloomberg would prefer to have in hand at this time. Does she need to flesh that out a little bit more or have other surrogates do it for her this week, considering it still is showing up as a weak point?
Yeah, I have a particular point of view on that. I think she should drop it immediately and never speak about it again, because it's a classic tax and spend Democratic philosophy. You know, we're going to raise taxes and we're going to spend it on things that we don't really have to spend it on. I mean, like trillions of dollars were announced on Thursday that the government doesn't have. And where's she going to get the money? It's going to be coming from your taxpayer dollars. And so I think that actually it was kind of a flop. I mean, the fact that we're talking about it today on the eve of her convention as like not having a lot of details, a lot of questions about where you're going to get the money, raising the deficit in a potentially inflationary period of time. These are all troubling things at a time when she is not winning the hearts and minds of voters on the economy. And then the other big issue, the second most important issue in most of the swing states, is immigration. And it's like the third rail for her. She can't touch it because she was once in charge of it, and now it's like something she can't talk about.
I want to talk about Joe Biden's job tonight and what we're going to see and hear. And I'm going to start by bringing us back a couple of years to 2020 and Joe Biden's acceptance speech at the last Democratic National Convention.
Here and now, I give you my word. If you entrust me with the presidency, I will draw on the best of us, not the worst. I will be an ally of the light, not the darkness. It's time for us, for we the people, to come together. And make no mistake, united we can and will overcome this season of darkness in America.
Fast forward to Chicago 2024, Jeanne. A lot has changed here, obviously. I started our conversation with Congressman Jackson by asking him if this is a good night or a bad night for Joe Biden. Could the answer be both?
I think it's going to be mixed feelings for him. You know, he has not famously missed a convention since the last 50 years, except for, I think, one in 1988 when he was ill. So he has been a huge part, obviously, of this party, has served in many capacities. And to your point, tonight is mixed feelings, I would assume. He thought he was going to be at the top of this ticket. He is saying, you know, farewell, move on, although he's still going to be serving as president. But you do hear him saying, and his associates saying, that the message tonight from him is going to be win. You've got to beat Donald Trump. So I think Joe Biden, having been through so many difficulties in his life, this is certainly mixed feelings, but I think overall he's going to be optimistic.
Reporting inside the White House is he's angry.
I think he does have.
He feels betrayed.
I think he probably does have some resentment. He's also a political animal, and he too can see these polls that we've been talking about. He knows that this was the right move for the party and the country. And so I think as much as he's frustrated, he will, you know, reflect the fact Democrats have to move forward and move on. And he had a huge choice in bringing us to where we are with Kamala Harris.
Well, certainly Democrats will allow him the time tonight to reflect on his legacy and to celebrate the president he has been. Things move on very quickly. President Biden himself, after he gives this speech, is getting out of town, going on vacation with the First Lady to California. He is removing himself physically from the rest of this convention. Does the convention have to basically physically remove him from the conversation, or conversationally remove him for the remainder of it, and just focus on Harris from Tuesday morning onward?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. They have to do a hard pivot on Tuesday, and they've got Barack Obama to do it. So, like, what better person to change the story? Look, I mean, when I was running John McCain's campaign in 2008, we had an incredibly unpopular president, George Bush, who wanted to speak at the convention. Frankly, you have to do that. He wound up doing it because of different circumstances from the Oval Office, didn't even show up in town. And that was a good hard pivot for us, right? Get it on your candidate, not on the past, but in the future. And look, I think Jeannie's right. Joe Biden is a pro, right? He's been at this longer than anybody else we know. And he's not going to screw up tonight. But the tone tonight could really be important for getting this convention kicked off. And if he doesn't do a good job, and I think that's a coin flip, just, you know, his ability to communicate is pretty, you know, significantly deteriorated. And so, you know, do you want to start the convention with that kind of tone?
It's a great point that Rick makes. Which Joe Biden shows up tonight? We've had a chance to see.
Biden,
correct.
Debate Biden.
Or debate Biden. Are we going to have trouble understanding him? What would that do to this convention?
You know, I think that would be troubling for all Americans. And so we hope that he is feeling well. He famously has said he wasn't feeling well at the debate. We've seen other moments like that. I would also say they're giving gift bags with a cup of Joe coffee. Not our Joe, but the other Joe. And they have a quote from his Oval Office address stepping down: "History is in your hands." And I think that's what he's going to reflect. So hopefully he's well and he does the job that he's capable of doing. But I think that would be troubling for Democrats if he stumbles.
Well, something else that's remarkable is obviously the current incumbent Democratic president is going to speak, but we will also hear from two other former Democratic presidents, Barack Obama, as Rick mentioned, and Bill Clinton speaking this week. It does show that the people who've held the highest office, at least in the Democratic Party, are aligned behind Harris and still in the game. At the Republican convention, his vice president, formerly, Mike Pence, wasn't there. You didn't see George W. Bush there. Dick Cheney wasn't there. How important is it to have the other most elite of the party gathered here and having the backing of Harris?
I think it's critically important. It does show a difference from to the Republican Party, where they didn't have that show of unity. Democrats want to show unity in the convention hall, even though we have about 30 uncommitted delegates outside the convention hall with the protesters. So the support of Obama, Clinton, Carter's grandson, Hillary Clinton, a nominee who ran against, Donald Trump and lost, that's all critically important to saying we support Kamala Harris and want to move forward.
When you consider the rhetorical balance for somebody who's run a convention, Rick, this new party platform that they'll be voting on here today mentions Donald Trump's name 150 times. Where is the balance between making this convention about Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, this platform, because platforms usually are the document to describe your party. And nowadays, it's the document to describe your opponent's party.
How about that?
and so I think the whole nature of a platform has changed. And frankly, unfortunately for Kamala Harris, because she needs a platform. Nobody really knows her that well. I know she's been vice president for 3.5 years, but the reality is she's introducing herself on Thursday night to the American public. More people will pay attention to her than ever before that night. And she doesn't have a party platform that's anything other than a political document to oppose the Republicans. And so it's all up to her now. You know, there's nothing to fall back on. There's no soft landing. And I think it's a huge mistake that parties make. Republicans did it 4 years ago. They didn't even have a platform, right? So the ideology was Donald Trump. There was no other ideology. And so I think that parties should actually reconsider the approach they're taking with these platforms and actually start to articulate what they're for and why.
Well, on the subject of articulating what you're for, we, of course, have seen in recent weeks Kamala Harris coming under immense criticism, especially from the Trump-Vance campaign, for not making herself available to the press, not yet sitting down for a big interview. Meantime, the Trump campaign this week, as part of their counter-programming efforts, apparently are going to be including daily press conferences and conversations with the press. Jeanne, does it risk taking some oxygen away from Kamala Harris that she is not doing the same?
I think so. I think she really does need to sit down with the press. Somebody told me she's running a risk not having done it prior to the convention because at some point she is going to get tripped up in one of these tough interviews. Better to do that before than after. They've chosen to do it after. I think it's a risky strategy, and she has questions to answer. You look at that economic policy she laid out, and even Jason Furman came out and said, this doesn't add up. And so she's got tough questions to answer on the economy, to Rick's point on immigration, and a whole host of issues. I wish she had done it before, and I do think the counter-programming just underscores the fact we're hearing a lot from Trump and Vance and not as much in a tough-hitting interview from Kamala Harris. And she's capable of doing it. She's a prosecutor, but she's got to get out there and do it.
Well, it's interesting. I think it's obviously good for the process. It's good for us as journalists to see that happen. But when I put myself in the shoes of her campaign, why put her out at all, Rick? When you're leading in the polls, while you've got the moment here, doesn't that just add unneeded risk?
Yeah, I think that, to disagree with Jeanne on this, the reality is it's hard to argue that anything she's done since Joe Biden got out of this race has been anything other than perfect. Look at the meteoric rise in her polling number and the enthusiasm in the party. I mean, it's hard to criticize. I like to criticize her economic plan, but the reality is the big problem she's got, or not that she's got it, but the Republicans are making this an issue, right? Oh, you're not talking to the press.
Yes.
The problem is the minute she talks to the press, that goes away as an issue, right? So why invest in that kind of an attack when you know it only takes one interview to offset it? And so I think it's kind of a false flag. It's one of those things that people really don't care about. They see enough of her in the reporting. I think we can extend an invitation to come here while she's in Chicago and give an interview to Bloomberg.
Yes.
We'll inoculate that entire attack from.
We can get this done today. Yeah, but I'm not sure that's going to happen, Kaylee.
We'll let you know where we are, Madam Vice President and her team.
You can
find us here on Bloomberg TV and radio, and you certainly are welcome. Great idea, Rick. Thank you so much. Of course, it would have to be today or Thursday or Friday because she's actually leaving Chicago tomorrow. Jeanne, she and Tim Walz are going to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where the RNC was held just weeks ago. Certainly that location is not a coincidence, but should she really be leaving the big event?
Not if she's supposed to be talking to you, too. But if she's not, no, she absolutely should. She's got to, she's taking it to Donald Trump's house as it will. And she is, going to a swing state, critically important. I do think they want to retain their ability to attract these big crowds has been something that has really upset the former president. So I do think that makes sense. But here's a problem with what Rick said. If she has a flub after this convention in one of these interviews, yes, if she does a great job, that's true. But if she flubs, and she has in the past, then that is going to be a problem for her. So I do think she needs to talk to you guys and the press and get these interviews taken care of because it's becoming an issue.
Does the same go for Tim Walz? Can't he kind of fly cover for her, do some interviews while she's getting her bearings after this convention?
He should. I've learned a lesson the hard way.
Well, I guess that's right.
Sarah Palin undercover for a couple of weeks after the convention and took a lot of heat for it. And I actually do think that affected at least her image a little bit.
Sure.
But he's a readily available guy. He's been on the stump, well in advance of the convention. Nobody had ever heard of Sarah Palin until Wednesday night of our convention.
That's right.
So it's a different circumstance. But look, I mean, it's not like a month from now we're going to have this conversation. It's going to have changed.
Sure.
And so what you look for in politics are those things that will exist past Election Day. And this is not one of those things.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino will last past this segment. They're with us for the week here in Chicago, our signature political panel and Bloomberg Politics contributors. And of course, we still have much more coming up on this program. In the next hour, we'll be joined by two lawmakers. Senator Laphonza Butler will be with us, Congressman Casten as well, also of Illinois. We got a lot of hometown people on the program today.
That's right. That's the idea. They've come from all over the country, 50,000 people in Chicago for this convention. But we are talking with some voices from Chicago with some important local issues tied to the economy that we're going to be addressing here over the balance of this week. It is day one, though, the DNC, just across the street, basically from where we're sitting right now. Kaylee, the roll call is going to follow. The aforementioned party platform will be passed, and then it's on to the speechifying later on.
And of course, that all culminates with the speech from the sitting president, Joe Biden, no longer seeking re-election, in part a legacy speech, in part a passing of the torch to his vice president, Kamala Harris. It is now her convention, not his. And we'll have it all covered for you, of course, right here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power.
From Bloomberg Studios in Chicago, just across the street from the United Center at the Democratic National Convention, to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. We will be here all week as this is the nominated convention of Vice President Kamala Harris. But it begins this evening with a primetime address from Joe Biden, the current president, who, of course, made the decision to pass the baton to his VP and will speak tonight, leave town. It is a literal passing of the torch that's about to happen here in Chicago.
Yeah, this is going to be an important night, Kaylee. And of course, there is a bit of business to be had before we get to the speeches tonight with the roll call, the adoption of the party platform. Once that's done, of course, we have official nominees already. As we've discussed, that was handled virtually before we arrived here in Chicago. Then it's going to be rally time. After Joe Biden speaks tonight, the next four all have their own themes, culminating with Kamala Harris on Thursday Kaylee, this is going to be quite a moment for her, having not known she would be in this position just 5 weeks ago.
That's a very excellent point. And of course, Joe and I will have it fully covered for you, as will our team here in Chicago. Bloomberg's Laura Davison and Gregory Cordy are among them, politics reporter and editor, respectively. Thank you both so much for joining us here in Chicago. It's obviously going to be a week. This will be a marathon, not a sprint. But coming into this, it does feel like Kamala Harris is the candidate of the two, the other being Donald Trump, with the momentum as she arrives here in town, Laura.
Yeah, she has all the money behind her. She's got the celebrities who are excited. The staff who is running the DNC just in the past 3 or 4 weeks has been scrambling to accommodate for all the surge and interest that's happening. They're running a bunch of ads. The polling, new polling over the weekend, both nationwide as well as swing states, shows that she's gaining or in some cases even eclipsing Trump's lead. So Democrats are feeling really, really good right now.
Joe Biden's going to speak to this crowd tonight. The First Lady will as well. Gregory, there's been a lot of reporting about the emotional state that he's in, the way he feels about this, some weeks after being urged to drop out of the race. Some of that reporting indicates that he's still pretty angry about it. And as Donald Trump accuses Democrats of staging a coup, how does he thread the needle in this speech?
Yeah, it's been quite a demotion for him, really, because he was supposed to be the headliner speaking on Thursday night, accepting the nomination. Now he's the opening act. And by the reporting we have, he'll give his speech, and then he'll go back to Washington and continue to govern the country, right, do his day job. He's described his job as sort of the volunteer-in-chief for the Harris campaign. But look, historically, there has been a lot of tension between presidents and the vice presidents who would like to succeed them. And it's only natural that it's even more so under these circumstances. Joe Biden is going to end up being a one-term president, right? He still has his legacy that he wants to cement. That's, I think, a large part of what this speech is going to be about tonight. But also, he needs to pass the baton, and he needs to do so convincingly. He needs to tell Democrats that, no, this was my decision. Kamala Harris is the best candidate to move forward with my agenda.
Well, it raises the question, too, not just the emotional nature of this moment for the president, but for the others who will be gathered in the convention hall tonight, Laura. These are people, some of them sitting lawmakers, who have literally worked with Joe Biden as a politician for decades, who know him, who have been supporters of him during his presidency and beforehand. What is it going to do to the overall vibe of a convention that does feel, as we alluded to, like a celebration coming in, but could maybe not feel as celebratory, but quite bittersweet this evening?
There almost are two camps here. You know, the people who have been involved in Democratic politics for a long time, who were with Joe Biden till the bitter end, who did not want him to see him step down, but of course are now supporting Harris. These are the people who have known him for 50 years. They've worked with him for a long time. You know, Harris is a relative newcomer to Washington. She's really only been there, just for a handful of years. And so she doesn't have some of those deep ties with, longtime party operatives, as well as, donors and other people who are kind of critical to the operation. However, sort of the newcomers, the content creators that they're going to have, the celebrities, all of the stuff that has bubbled up in sort of the more popular culture interest about this, those are the people who are here for Harris and, frankly, in some cases excited that she is at the top of the ticket and that Biden is now a figure, soon to be a figure of the past.
A lot of folks rose their eyebrows when Democrats announced Chicago as the site of this convention, and everyone started talking about 1968. That conversation has not ended, as tens of thousands of protesters have also joined us here. The parallels go beyond just the geography, Gregory. This is a party that's just seen a sitting president decide publicly to step down. We've got thousands of protesters around us. Gunfire has been heard on the campaign trail in the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. And the cultural and generational divides are pronounced. You can't move away from the comparisons in this case. How does Kamala Harris turn our attention away from what happened in 1968?
Look, I may well be the oldest person at this table, but I was born after 1968, so I don't remember it. I think a lot of Americans don't remember that. It certainly does have some historic resonance, and we'll have to see. Look, if we get anything approaching what we saw in 1968, obviously it's going to be a game-changing event for this campaign. Sure. But in the meantime, we have had a routine since the 1990s of really treating these conventions as, they're called national security special events. Secret Service is the lead agency, but we have police officers here from several states around, not just Chicago, but they're coming from Ohio and Wisconsin and Minnesota, police on the ground. You can't walk down Michigan Avenue without seeing literally thousands of police officers.
True.
And so this is, they're going to try to run a tight ship, but you also have protesters from all over those states and beyond that I just talked about. And people, this is especially for the Democratic Party. You have constituency groups that want to make their voice heard, and the loudest one right now is the progressives within the party who are very angry about what's going on in Gaza right now, and they're going to make their voice heard.
Well, and of course, it comes against a backdrop of ongoing efforts toward a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. The U.S., Qatar, Egypt are involved in these conversations. It's just frankly still unclear at this point, Laura, whether they will have a different end result than the negotiations we've seen over the last several months and actually result in a ceasefire. This is something we have heard Kamala Harris advocating for on the campaign trail. Do you expect she'll take her moment on Thursday night to do the same, to try to influence the outcome of policy here?
She can't not address this. This has to, this is the big elephant in the room. This is the major issue dividing the party, and she's going to have to sort of nod at this in some level. She is, however, in a very politically advantageous position because Biden, as president, is still working on this, and this is one of the issues he sees as his legacy-defining things, one of the things he wants to wrap up before he's out of office. So he can kind of do the hard work of that while she can talk about it, she can frame it, she can message it to the party, but they're able to, this is one of the key advantages of her being able to focus on the campaign trail, and he can focus on the foreign policy side.
Reporting from Bloomberg's best, Laura Davison and Gregory Cordy. Great to see you both at the table here as we kick things off for this week in Chicago. Joining us from just outside the United Center is California Senator Laphonza Butler. Senator, we want to welcome you to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's great to be with you today in Chicago. I think it's safe to say that you know Kamala Harris better than most Americans ever will. And as we consider what she's going through right now, being shot out of a cannon here at a Democratic National Convention that she could not have planned for even 2 months ago, tell us what she's going through emotionally.
Look, I don't thank you so much for having me, for covering this, for offering this experience to folks who are watching and listening on Bloomberg. I couldn't pretend to know what Vice President Harris is feeling. None of us could. She was so committed to being a loyal governing partner to President Biden. And today begins the convention that is the process of nominating her as the Democratic presidential nominee for this country. And so it is an exciting experience, I could imagine. I have spoken to her. She feels and sounds incredibly determined to be a leader that offers a vision forward for our country and for the American people, a way to unify us behind not just our fears and the things that we are concerned about, but also about our hopes and our dreams and the things that we can accomplish together. And so it must be incredibly exciting for her family. But I know this is a moment that she is determined to meet, and one that she, I think, will meet with great grace.
Well, Senator, of course, none of us can actually get inside the Democratic nominee's head at this time. But could you take us inside yours, knowing that before you were a senator, you ran Emily's List? It is a group literally dedicated to get women elected into office. Now we have not just a woman, but a woman of color getting ready to formally accept the Democratic nomination for president. What does this week mean to you?
I'm not sure that I know exactly what it will mean. I am so focused on making sure that I do everything I can to make this moment not just a moment that happens as a nominating experience, but an experience that actually leads to victory for the country in November. But you're right. I have worked to help to elect Democratic pro-choice women up and down the ballot at all levels of government, and to, again, be able to say that the United States, at least one party, is putting forth a woman and a woman of color for the American people to consider for a presidency is quite powerful, not just for my daughter, but truly for America's daughters to be able to see themselves once and for all in the highest position possible in our country. It is a moment of pride for me, and I think it will be a moment of great pride for the American people.
Senator, what is Joe Biden going to tell the room tonight as he passes the baton, the cliche that we keep using for this inflection point in the campaign? There's been reporting that he's very upset about what has happened, but of course it's his job to strike a positive tone. What should be his message? What are we going to hear from Joe Biden?
Look, this is, I expect that we're going to hear the words of a proud statesman. who has served his country for the last 52 years, made sacrifice after sacrifice to help us win back the soul of our very nation. He said that was why he was running in 2020. This is a president who will have accomplished by the end of his term some of the most historic legislation ever, changing the trajectory of so many industry and opportunities for the American people, whether we're talking about the cancellation of student loan debt to the inaction of the CHIPS and Science Act, the biggest investments in climate change in our nation's history, doing the work of the PACT Act and taking care of our veterans and their health care. So, look, this is a moment, I think, where President Biden will have the opportunity to not only talk about what he's accomplished, but to thank the American people for trusting him to lead in such a hard, tough moment. And I think he's going to commit to continue to finish the job, that we have a lot more work to do. He has another 5 months left in his term. He's going to be focused on continuing to run through the tape. But he's going to be exciting us and imploring us to continue to fight for the democracy that future generations in this country truly deserve.
Well, and of course, that fight will become Kamala Harris's throughout the remainder of this campaign. And then, of course, if she ultimately wins when she takes office in January of 2025, we are starting, Senator, to get at least the outlines of the kind of policy that she would like to pursue when it comes to the economy. And I ask you this knowing that you sit on the Senate Banking Committee. Some of the policies she put forward last week have been described as potentially inflationary. Donald Trump has suggested they borderline on communism, calling her now comrade. Kamala, are the ideas that she put forward really realistic?
Look, I think the former president has tried his attempt at name-calling against everyone who dared to take him on, and this is a presidential candidate, vice president in Kamala Harris, that is doing just that. Taking him on and putting forward visions and plans that actually bring our country together, that address some of our highest cost-driving issues that working families face today, the cost of housing, whether they want to own or rent, the cost of prescription drugs, whether they're taking cancer medication, or an elderly who's just trying to manage their diabetes, or just trying to make it every single day in the grocery store, buying bread and eggs and chicken to make sure that their family has food to eat. Yes, she has put forth an ambitious, I believe, practical approach that is about how do we listen to what the American people need from government and actually make plans to act. Are the plans going to turn out exactly the way that she put forth in her proposal in North Carolina? This is all going to be a process. She said herself what she wants to do is bring stakeholders together. She wants to bring industry and legislators and unions together to figure out how we try to solve some of these problems. I don't know what former President Trump is to do any of that. He hasn't said. He just says that he wants to create what in essence is a tax for the American people to raise their costs. So I'd rather be a part of a process to find a solid solution for the American people than some pipe dream tax that's going to raise the cost for every American person. And I think every day about my mother on a fixed income, 71 years old. I know she can't afford Donald Trump's tax.
Senator Butler, we have breaking news on the terminal with regard to Israel, and this is going to be important for the delegates on the floor of this convention. Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, says Benjamin Netanyahu has accepted a ceasefire proposal that they've been working on for days now. This just crossed the terminal. Netanyahu accepting latest Gaza proposal. He's speaking with reporters right now, talking about this U.S.-backed bridging proposal for a ceasefire, calling on Hamas to do the same. Your party platform, Senator, also calls for, quote, immediate and lasting ceasefire deal, unquote. If this comes to fruition, if we do have a ceasefire deal, are those 30 uncommitted delegates on the floor going to become committed to Kamala Harris?
You know, I don't know. I surely hope so. I wouldn't venture to speak for them, but let me just first say, thank God. The tragedy that we have been seeing that began on October 7th and has continued in the lives of innocent Palestinian families. I am glad that Joe Biden has remained on the case and has not let a night go by where he wasn't working towards accomplishing this ceasefire. If that is the case, this is a great and important day for the presidency of President Biden and a great moment of, I think, relief for so many families, Israeli and Palestinian families alike.
Well, and certainly it could be a moment of relief if you are actively campaigning for president, knowing that this is an issue, Senator, that has divided your party. And we've seen that on display with the delegates that Joe is alluding to, with the protests that will be here in Chicago. If a ceasefire can be accomplished, what's the biggest hurdle for your party to get over when it comes to voter turnout or to ensuring a victory for Kamala Harris?
Yeah, look, this is a war and a conflict that is beyond party politics. Both sides have taken their own positions. What we have seen President Biden and Vice President Harris work towards is that lasting ceasefire, the return of those hostages. And hopefully as the details of this deal becomes more clear, that we will have accomplished those things. And let's focus on these are lives that have been lost here. Tens of thousands of lives, the rape and torture of Israeli families on October 7th. I'm not going to jump into a conversation about politics when we're talking about people's lives. Yes, there has been disagreement in our country about this, but let's celebrate what is happening here. There are hundreds of Americans and Israelis and others that are actually going to be able to come home after nearly a year. Let's celebrate what we're accomplishing and recognize the diplomacy and the committed leadership that President Biden and Vice President Harris have brought, and all of the global leaders who have leaned in here to help make this happen.
Fair enough, Senator. Thank you so much for joining us outside the United Center here in Chicago. That is California's Democratic Senator Laphonza Butler. We appreciate your time, ma'am. And of course, to reiterate the breaking news here, Joe, Secretary of State Antony Blinken says that Israel and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has accepted this U.S.-backed bridging proposal for a ceasefire. He is now calling on Hamas to do the same. Of course, this is not a done deal until Hamas does so. There are two parties that need to agree to this.
Well, and remembering that Joe Biden rolled out a 6-point plan on the 31st of May that he said Benjamin Netanyahu had signed off on. So we have seen this movie before. We'll find out if it ends differently. Coming up, Congressman Sean Casten with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines live at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Monday, it's day one with work to be had. In the next few hours, we'll see Democrats adopt a party platform and codify the nominations, already done virtually, but here in Chicago, of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. Kaylee, it'll all come together later this evening with an address by President Biden, as we hear so much about passing the baton. This is actually it today.
Yeah, it will be a physical manifestation of that. He, of course, will be speaking after his wife, First Lady Jill Biden, in what is surely going to be emotional, as it was just over 4 weeks ago that the president made the decision to not seek re-election and instead to endorse Kamala Harris, who is getting ready to formally accept the nomination this week. It's a question of looking back at the past 3.5 years while looking forward to the next 4 that Kamala Harris would like to promise to the American people should she win in November.
That'll be the trajectory of the week here. Former President Barack Obama tomorrow night, Tim Walz Wednesday, and of course Kamala Harris in her acceptance speech on Thursday. We're going to be talking a lot about issues, many of which are mentioned in the party platform. We're also going to be talking about the massive protests that are expected. We saw some smaller protest marches last night, Kaylee, but there are tens of thousands of people who have made their way to Chicago because of one issue. That's Israel. And it's one that we're actually hearing some headlines on today.
Yeah, the breaking news just crossing the Bloomberg terminal from Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who says Israel and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have accepted a U.S.-backed bridge ceasefire proposal. They're calling on Hamas to do the same. Of course, it is not official until Hamas does so, but this could be an incredibly important moment for the incumbent president and for the presidential candidate herself, Kamala Harris, as this is an issue that has been quite politically disruptive, I would say, within the Democratic Party. And joining us now is someone who is within the Democratic Party and also is in his home state of Illinois. Congressman Sean Casten is here with us in our studios in Chicago. Congressman, it's great to see you, sir.
Thank you.
Obviously, this is just breaking as we speak, but I do wonder what your reaction is to this news that maybe a ceasefire is one step closer as we await word from Hamas.
You know, I think we're hopeful. I represent one of the largest Palestinian diasporas in the country, and you know we've had personal constituent stories where we've had to help get people out of Gaza, get people out of the West Bank, try to get people with their land freed up. I've also spent quite a bit of time traveling in the region and meeting with hostage families, and that there is a deal to be had. There's a deal that's been havable for a long time with absolutely getting the hostages back, absolutely preserving our relationship with Israel, absolutely providing dignity and hope, and hopefully ultimately a path to a Palestinian state. You know, unfortunately, some of the right-wing elements of the Israeli government and Hamas have been the biggest obstacles to that deal. So I'm encouraged to hear that maybe we have something. But we'll have to see what Hamas does next.
If this news is made official, if Hamas does accept this deal in the middle of the Democratic National Convention, what does that do to the issue? What does that do to the uncommitted delegates or the protesters outside the room? You're the perfect person to answer that, as you are specifically representing many constituents who are upset about this.
Well, given how long this conflict has persisted, I think if we try to solve it to address short-term U.S. political issues, we're probably not thinking about it the right way. You know, if this has been a long time coming, it was not helped in the prior administration when you know we had the Abraham Accords, which created some peace, but stapled to the Abraham Accords was this idea that it was okay for the Netanyahu government to sort of slice and dice the West Bank into this, you know, into something that gave no continuous property. And politically, of course, it would be wonderful to have a solution right now, but I think it's much more important that we have a long-term solution that we can look back on 5, 10 years from now and say, this was a turning point, not just this was something that was politically well-timed.
Sure. And of course, there is a massive humanitarian aspect here that we have to consider. Obviously, this is an issue you're passionate about given your constituency, Congressman, but we know there's other issues that you're passionate about and focus on in your work in Congress as well. One of them being climate. Taking a look at the policy platform the party's getting set to adopt today, Chapter 4 is tackling the climate crisis, and along with that, lowering energy costs. Obviously, Joe Biden has tried to be a climate president, certainly in the Inflation Reduction Act. He has had some legislative accomplishments in that regard. What do you expect Kamala Harris can do to advance that agenda moving forward, realistically knowing she might not necessarily have both chambers of Congress to work with here?
Well, number one, we have to give tremendous credit to Joe Biden. This was the single biggest climate bill ever passed by any government in the history of the world. And that came from my friend and my colleague, Kathy Castor, on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. We came up with a list of about 700 proposals, of which 300 of them are now law through the Inflation Reduction Act. Those are not only good bills for climate, they're good bills for energy. If you can heat your house without buying natural gas, you don't have to pay for natural gas. If you can drive your car without buying gasoline, you don't have to pay for gasoline. If you can power your house without buying electricity, you don't have to pay for electricity. Clean energy is cheap energy. And what's happened as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act has been a huge investment in America, huge amounts of capital that have come to build battery factories, electric vehicle charging. The challenges now, which are really good challenges, is we're creating jobs faster than skilled workers. We need to build the ecosystem to do that. We're building power plants where we have really cheap resources like sun, like wind. That's not necessarily where the wires are. And so how do we make it easier to build the transmission system, to build that up to load? We've got huge industries and factories and homes that are electrifying. They also need more power. So this is a huge investment opportunity. And I think the challenge that the Harris team understands is this is really a shift in our energy policy, from an energy policy that focuses on the interests of energy producers to an energy policy that focuses on the interest of energy consumers. And just to highlight that point, April 2020, Donald Trump got on the phone, called the Saudis, and said, I'm taking the troops out of Saudi Arabia unless you cut production to increase oil prices because our oil producers are struggling with cheap oil prices. understand who the Republican agenda is fighting for. They're fighting to raise energy prices for energy producers, and the Harris agenda is to fight to lower prices for consumers.
Well, interesting, because we're pumping a record amount of gas and oil right now. Donald Trump says drill, baby, drill is his answer to the inflation that we're experiencing here. Increased production, lower energy costs, everything else follows. He's also promising to roll back, essentially to do away with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, if he's elected. Do you take him at his word?
Donald Trump also says that electric vehicles could cause you to get attacked by a shark. I don't really know that his energy policy has a lot of.
I think Elon Musk turned him around on that last time. I'm not sure. But I mean, could Congress protect the IRA if Donald Trump's in the White House?
What we did very intentionally in the IRA is the IRA is long on carrots and short on sticks. There are a lot of communities in rural America, urban America, red America, blue America that are benefiting from access to capital. Once you have a solar panel on your roof, there is no scenario where you say the price of electricity is too low today for me to justify operating my solar panel, right? On the other hand, if you've got a gas turbine, there are times when you say, boy, the price of gas is too high for me to justify operating the gas turbine. So that capital deployment is going to be very hard to undo. I do think it's important on this sort of drill, baby, drill is like run the math. U.S. coal consumption has collapsed in the last decade. U.S. oil consumption is flat over the last decade. Gas consumption is up, but it's decoupled from GDP growth. Our economy is decarbonizing. The only future for the oil, gas, and coal industry, production industry in the U.S. is for exports. And so we're seeing this surge in exports in the United States and indeed a surge in production. But I think the question we have is like, if we as Americans know that we have access to cheaper and cleaner energy, are we going to make a commitment to exporting the technologies that we've manufactured in the United States with U.S. expertise so that other countries can benefit from our knowledge? Or are we going to export the more expensive, dirty energy sources that we've decided can't compete in our economy? Like, that's the practical reality. And again, there is a difference there between the two candidates. But you're right that the U.S. is producing record amounts of oil and gas right now, but it's increasingly for export.
Well, but Donald Trump does see it as a way in which to fight inflation. So it becomes, if it's not drill, baby, drill for the Democratic Party or for Vice President Harris, the actual efforts that she would have to fight inflation. Some of the economic policies she rolled out last week, and I'm asking you as a member of the Financial Services Committee, you get to question Chairman Powell and Treasury Secretary Yellen frequently. We think about some policies as being inflationary, including, for example, subsidizing home ownership or anything that could create a larger deficit that you can't necessarily pay for. All of this could have inflationary effects, could it not? How do you really look at the platform she rolled out last week?
Well, look at what happened since 2020. The United States, there was a global surge in inflation. The United States, because of the actions that we took in the American Rescue Plan, saw inflation rise slower than other OECD countries and come down faster, right? And the big difference, and this was very intentional, was, particularly compared to 2008, was to try to make sure that we were getting resources to people regardless of whether or not they had existing banking relationships, right? And so, yes, we saw inflation in the United States, but we saw wage inflation generally higher than goods inflation in the U.S. Didn't happen in other countries, right? So we've seen a closing of the wealth gap, particularly with lower quartiles, black and brown communities who have historically been left behind. And that structure of saying, let's make it easier for folks to buy homes, let's make it easier for people to buy things like solar panels that maybe they don't have the capital for it, but once they have it, now they have cheaper energy, right? And to push from there, and just to come back on the export again, we have massive amounts of oil and gas in the United States. If we want to keep oil and gas costs low in the United States, we should maximize the supply in the United States because high supply leads to low prices, right? When we export, we actually raise the price. And you've seen there's the Freeport LNG terminal down in Texas had an outage a couple of years ago. When it went out, immediately the price of gas, natural gas in the United States, went down because all of a sudden we couldn't export as much and there was a surge in the United States. Again, what is in our interest? Is it in our interest to lower costs for American consumers or in our interest to raise prices so that U.S. exporters can make more money? That's an inflation strategy, right? The other thing that I just say on inflation is one of the real blessings that's helped keep inflation low has been because the United States is a country that people want to come to. We've seen a surge in net immigration to the United States, which has kept wage pressure down. And of course, we want secure borders, but I think it's important to understand that an intelligent immigration policy is one of the tools that we have to keep inflation down. And if we just look at what Donald Trump's saying, I'm going to clamp down on inflation, I'm going to increase tariffs, that's a massively inflationary policy.
We have less than a minute left, Congressman. Will it be incumbent upon Kamala Harris then to explain to the American people, with your financial services hat on, why her plans are not inflationary?
I think I trust the American people to understand that. Yeah. I trust the American people to understand. I mean, one of the things that I like to do, I did a town hall a while ago, and somebody said, "What are you doing to lower inflation?" And I said, "Did you get a raise last year?" And the guy said, "I did." I said, "Was it a good raise?" He said, "Yeah, it was pretty good." And I said, "Well, number one, you're welcome. Number two, does it bother you that that was inflationary?"
It's funny how that works.
What matters is that people have more money in their pocket after they've bought all of the groceries and everything else. Exactly. Yeah. And I think we've seen a really strong and growing record growth in the U.S. economy, record low unemployment. We're going to keep it up.
It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
In Chicago. Have a great convention.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
On Bloomberg TV and radio. Illinois Congressman Sean Casten with us here on Balance of Power. We've got a lot more ahead from Chicago, but we want to keep tabs on the markets too. And for that, we turn to Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle in New York. How's it going, Abigail?
Well, Joe, you know, it's interesting. We're looking at a classic summer melt up here. We now have the S&P 500 up for an 8th day in a row. That's the longest winning streak going back to November of 2023. The NASDAQ 100 is also higher, heading to a 5th up day. And the Russell 2000, or those small cap stocks, those more domestically based stocks during this DNC week, outperforming a little bit, up 0.8%, up for a 3rd day in a row. Now, beneath the surface, though, volume is pretty anemic for that S&P 500, 30% below the recent average. So investors not all that committed to these gains, which is sort of interesting. And of course, we did have that big sell-off into the last 8 days, down about 10%, now up about 7%. So still at a deficit from the recent highs. Now, influencing trade today, some retail earnings will trickle in this week. They actually did already, Estee Lauder and then importantly Target. But I would say this week is much more about the macro because, of course, we do have the DNC in election 2024, that focus. We also have the yen. There's been so much news about the yen carry trade unwind. And in fact, a couple of weeks ago when stocks were selling off so brutally, that had everything to do with the haven yen rallying, which pushes the dollar yen lower. When the yen is lower, the actual yen, it provides cheap money for people to borrow that and then put it into any other risk asset. One of the reasons that we may have had such a big rally, robust rally for stocks so far this year. Now, earlier today, that yen had rallied by more than 1%. At that point, stocks about flat. But now that it's off of those highs, I think that's giving a little bit of relief to stocks. Plus, we have bonds rallying. That means yields are lower in expectation with the Fed. And speaking of the Fed, Jackson Hole later this week, we'll be listening to Fed Chair Jerome Powell's keynote speech, one of the highlights for market watchers every year. I think it's largely expected that he's going to toe the line in terms of cuts ahead. But of course, we are at DNC election 2024. If we go into the Bloomberg terminal and take a look at where predicted is relative to the betting odds, well, it is wider, but it's also narrower. So at the widest between Kamala Harris, VP Harris, and Donald Trump, it was something like 12 to 13%. Now it's 10% in favor of Kamala Harris, with Donald Trump trailing, which is, of course, a big reversal of what had been the case with Joe Biden. And on the day, we do have the shares of some of the Harris trade stocks, such as grocers, trading lower on the prospect of stabilized grocery prices, home builders higher, and DJT itself is down. So overall, Kaylee, I would say it's not a bad day for the quote-unquote Harris trade. This as the DNC, of course, kicks off.
All right, Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle in New York. Thank you so much. Keeping an eye on the political and market implications of politics, we always appreciate, but of course, giving us a good reminder that this convention is not happening in a vacuum. It comes at the same week as Jackson Hole, where we'll hear from Chairman Powell at the end of the week about interest rates and the trajectory of them, which could have implications for this election. It also comes with ceasefire talks making progress in the Middle East. The headline crossing this hour from the Bloomberg terminal, Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying that Israel has accepted a ceasefire agreement, and now we wait for Hamas.
In a very constructive meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu today, he confirmed to me that Israel accepts the bridging proposal, that he supports it. It's now incumbent on Hamas to do the same. And then the parties, with the help of the mediators, the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, have to come together and complete the process of reaching clear understandings about how they'll implement the commitments that they've made.
So let's bring back now our political panel here in Chicago. Rick Davis, partner at Stonecourt Capital, and Jeanne Zaino, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. So incredible to get this news as we're sitting here in Chicago waiting for President Biden to speak this evening, knowing that he has said a ceasefire agreement is one of the things he wants to make sure he accomplishes before leaving office. Obviously, there are massive humanitarian implications here for the people living in Gaza, for the families of the hostages, for the hostages themselves, Jeanne, that cannot go unsaid. But politically, this is significant as well.
This is, and I think, you know, we can be cautiously optimistic about what Anthony Blinken has said, but of course I think we have to be cautious because at the same time Hamas has said it's dissatisfied with what it describes as some of Israel's demands in this. And so I think we do, to your point, have to wait and see. If this comes to fruition, the timing is critically important for all of the reasons you mentioned, which are the most important, but also politically, because if it came together today before President Biden speaks, that would be enormously important for his legacy, which he is attached to this in a profound way. And of course, issues involving the Middle East have had an enormously negative impact on presidents going back several decades in the U.S. So for him to be thinking about leaving office in January and to have a win like this, if it happens, would be enormously important.
Well, caution is the important word, I think, in your setup there, Jeanne, because we've seen this before. Joe Biden made an address to the nation from the White House about this plan back around Memorial Day, and it was not signed off on at the time, apparently, by the Netanyahu government, and Hamas went back and forth for weeks on this. It ended with nothing. We just asked Sean Casten, who made clear that his constituents represent one of the largest blocs of pro-Palestinian voters in the country. He was very careful when we asked him about this. He didn't want to see this move in too quickly this week, a long-term deal, he said. How careful should Democrats be right now with such a hot issue around this convention?
Yeah, I think you have to be very careful. I'm pessimistic that if your peace is reliant upon Hamas, you're going to have to wait. Hamas wants a permanent ceasefire. They don't want a situational one. And for that reason alone, they will probably reject this offer. They've rejected previous offers that were similar in nature to this one. As you say, they've been talking about this for a long time. I don't think there's any reason to believe that Hamas is going to see this as anything different.
Is it smart politically to do this in public then, to goad them to it?
Well, look, I mean, I think it's good to have government transparency, right? I mean, like, this is an important issue, as Jeanne says. To a lot of people, it's not just politics. And I think it's good that this is being aired out. We don't normally get to see sausage being made in these kinds of negotiations. But I think it's too soon to tell whether or not Hamas is prepared to come to the table and actually be a part of a community that wants to see peace. It's not been their history, and they've been very clear that they want a permanent ceasefire. They just don't want to pay for it.
Well, it's also worth noting Hamas operates as a proxy of Iran. We are still awaiting Iranian retaliation against Israel for the assassination of leaders of Hezbollah and, of course, Hamas in Tehran earlier this summer. So that maybe is a complicating factor in all of this as well. But it was described to us as, by our political editor, Laura Davison, earlier this hour, Jeanne, as really something that actually can create some separation between President Biden, who is president and therefore is the one that really has to deal with this, and Kamala Harris, who can speak about it, who can try to frame it to her benefit, but doesn't necessarily have that commander-in-chief title at this time, where this is incumbent upon her to deal with. So to what extent, regardless of whether or not Hamas accepts or the negotiations are still ongoing, should Harris be talking about this issue or others, like economy and the border, at the convention this week?
You know, I think the convention, we're not going to hear a lot of policy specifics. I think we're going to hear an introduction of Kamala Harris because a lot of people are not intimately familiar with her, even though she's been in our lives as vice president for almost 4 years now. So that's going to be what she does this week. We will hear more about policy going forward. But to your point, I don't think we're going to hear a lot on the specifics of something like this. And so, you know, she is going to try to get some of that separation from President Biden on things that he is not particularly popular on, and try to embrace those things he is. So if there was a win on this, that would be enormously helpful. But most importantly, for the families of the hostages and all the people affected by this, regardless of the politics of this thing.
Well, if you're running a convention, though, and you've got 30 uncommitted delegates on the floor, is this an opportunity? There may not be a deal here, but this week in Chicago, there might be a sit-down conversation between the Harris campaign and those delegates to say, look, we're trying to move the ball.
Right. I think anything you can do to sort of inoculate the convention to delegates who aren't looking at the same success you are is important. You're going to do that anyway.
You wouldn't just ignore it.
They've been doing it. You wouldn't just ignore it. Maybe their bus breaks down on the way to the convention on Thursday night, but that's another thing. But the reality is you don't usually get hard news at a convention. And it would be really a kudo for Biden to be able to talk about this tonight. Now, with Israel signing on, maybe that's enough for him. But to get a ceasefire the night of your, last speech to the convention as president, it would be a really special moment for him. And suffice it to say, I doubt if Hamas is really caring whether or not Joe Biden has a good night or not.
Well, fair enough, but it will be a night for Joe Biden, the only one, frankly, he's going to get at this convention. Jeanne, we've talked at length about how difficult this moment may be emotionally, given his long career in public service, but he has made the decision to pass the baton and will do so in a very real way. This evening, we're also going to be hearing from members of his family. Jill Biden is speaking tonight. Ashley Biden is introducing him, according to the speaker's list. What tone do you expect to hear, not just from the president, but from those closest to him?
I think we're going to hear the closeness of their relationship with their husband, their father. This is a family who has gone through so much trauma, especially in the last few years. And so I think we're going to hear a lot of love and respect from them. And I think they're going to be celebrating his work. I mean, 1972, he enters Congress at 29, and he departs today, the convention, or tonight, the convention, and in a few months, the presidency. So it's a big moment for him. But I think most important, they're all going to agree, we want Kamala Harris to succeed and beat Donald Trump.
So prepare for a lot of young photos of Joe Biden with dark hair is what you're saying.
That's right.
Great conversation with our signature panel, as always. Rick Davis, Jeanne, Zaino are going to be with us for the week here in Chicago, with a lot more to follow as the DNC gets underway. We are expecting to get more details about Vice President Harris's policy platform. In fact, we heard a preview last week when it came to the economy specifically, and housing even more so. For more on that issue, we bring in Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who's just outside the convention hall, the United Center here in Chicago. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe. Housing affordability and availability are becoming top issues on the campaign trail. As you mentioned, Vice President Kamala Harris started to unveil some of her economic policies last week. While we're still waiting for more details, she did make housing a key part of her policy proposal. I want you to take a listen here to what she told voters on Friday when it came to housing and how she's messaging around the issue.
I know how to fight for people who are being exploited in the housing market. And I know what home ownership means. It's more than a financial transaction. It's so much more than that. It's more than a house.
Harris's plan calls for the construction of 3 million new housing units over 4 years, as well as a tax incentive for building starter homes. Harris has also pledged $25,000 in down payment assistance for some first-time homebuyers, and the campaign is also urging Congress to pass an act that would curtail major investors from buying single-family homes in bulk for development. Now, Fed Chair Jerome Powell has said that tighter monetary policy is impacting the housing market, and we'll have to wait to see how any expected rate cuts in September could unlock the market in any way. But Joe and Kaylee, Powell also often points out that the Fed can control a shortage of affordable housing units in the parts of the market that need it the most.
Yep, can hit demand but not supply. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall reporting outside the United Center. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm pleased to bring in now With us here in Chicago, someone with a unique perspective on real estate and rates in general. The CEO of Chicago developer Sterling Bay, Andy Gloor, is here on set with Joe and I. Welcome to Bloomberg TV and Radio. Andy, it's great to have you. I would like to start, as we are here for the Democratic Convention. It is DNC week. It's also Jackson Hole week, which our audience is perhaps just as equally, if not more, enthused about. Obviously, the real estate industry has felt high interest rates in a very real way. What kind of cuts are you expecting, and what happens for your business, for your industry when they come?
Well, I will say this. I mean, I think the commercial real estate business has been under a Category 5 storm for a few years now, to say the least. And if you look at the real estate business, you can only control so many things: your cost of capital, your cost to build the building, and then how much people will pay. And unfortunately, two of those things have been in all-time highs for the last 25 years. And so we are hoping, I was hoping in June something might have happened, but we're hoping for at least 50 basis points in September and hopefully another 50 basis points. And I think that will be a green shoot that everyone's looking for that will slowly start allowing the capital that's been sitting on the sidelines to start investing.
You got to love coming on Bloomberg. Kaylee Lines hit you with the Fed on the first.
We got a lot more to say there,
Well, I bet that's true. Talk to us about Chicago, though. What would that mean for record vacancy rates in this city that have been so sticky?
Yeah, I think if you look at Chicago, it's not dissimilar to other major urban areas. Is that you have concentration of office, you have office that is B and C type product, and so I think you need to lower the cost of capital for people to start making investments back into these urban areas. And let's face it, we need to get these cities back on track. We need to get people coming back to work, and I think that you need to change some of the fundamentals, as I said, with interest rates, to make that a reality.
Is the money there, though? Is the interest there? Everyone's waiting for the bottom, waiting for the moment?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say we're in the trough. Yeah. And I think people are just looking for a green shoot. They want to see the Fed make a move. And I think most people think the Fed was too slow in curbing inflation up front. I think that's widely accepted. I just hope they're not too slow on lowering rates going forward.
Okay, so if we're in the trough, does that make this the prime opportunity for a bargain?
Yes.
Then are you running out of time to pick up on some of those opportunities?
Real estate doesn't move that quickly, but what I would say over the next 2 quarters, I don't think there is a better time in commercial real estate to acquire because of the dislocation. So I think you're right. I think the opportunities that we're seeing, we haven't seen in 20 years. And so I think it is a great time. And now it's a contrarian move. You have to have the capital there, but I do think there's a lot of institutional capital sitting on the sidelines waiting for the Fed to make a move.
We've heard a bit from Donald Trump about the city of Chicago. Just most recently, about a week ago, compared it to Afghanistan, referring to crime stats here. Let's go back to 2019, as this is not a new refrain for the former president. Here's Donald Trump.
It's embarrassing to us as a nation. All over the world, they're talking about Chicago. Afghanistan is a safe place by comparison. It's true.
Saying the same thing now 5 years later. What does Donald Trump not understand about Chicago?
I think at the time, during the pandemic, Chicago, like other urban areas, it was a terrible time, and crime skyrocketed. I think if you look at the statistics now, we're going in the right direction. Not just
pointing to the 4th of July just last week, said 117 shootings took place here, more than happened in Afghanistan.
I'll say this, it's a #1 priority for the city. It needs to remain a #1 priority. No one is happy with where we're at right now. It needs to improve, but we are taking steps in the right direction, whether that takes another year or 2 or longer. I just want to make sure that no matter what happens over the next few years, it has to remain a top priority. If people don't feel safe here, they're not going to relocate their businesses here. They're not going to live here. So that has to remain a top priority.
Well, and of course, the city's not a monolith. You've invested in specific areas. You were a key part in building out Fulton Market. Where are you looking at new opportunities? As we talk about picking up these bargains and spending capital, where within Chicago do you invest?
I mean, I think if you look at the demographics, we obviously have substantial holdings here in Chicago, but we're in a dozen markets around the country. We're in Charlotte, we're in Atlanta, we're in Durham, we're in Miami, we're in Austin. So we are definitely diversified geographically. We're also diversified from a product standpoint. So we started off doing primarily office, and now we do office, industrial, life science, and residential. So,
with our eyes on the housing market for a moment, we're just hearing about Kamala Harris's platform. She's offering, or wants to offer, $25,000 in down payment assistance to more than 1 million first-time home buyers. What would that do to the market? What would that do to prices?
Well, I would say this. There's a national housing shortage, both for workforce housing and just housing in general. And so we have to find a way to jumpstart that segment. And one of those ways is lowering rates. And one of those ways potentially could be government incentives to expedite that process. But it's definitely an issue, not just in Chicago, but around the country as well.
Well, you clearly have some thoughts for Chairman Powell, and others have as well. I mean, Donald Trump has suggested that he would like to play a role in monetary policy decision-making if he wins. Kamala Harris, for her part, seems to be more on the Fed is independent train. But it does speak to this idea that the outcome of this election could have an impact here as well. So knowing the lens with which you are viewing it, what is your view on what happens in November?
I would say as long as there's open communication and collaboration, it's not unlike what's happening with the Supreme Court. Whether that should be a term for life, I'm not the guy to answer that, but I do think there needs to be some input from the government into the Fed.
You do?
Yeah, I do. I do. What that looks like, what autonomy they maintain, as I said, it's not my expertise, but I do think, based on how I think too slow they were to cut rates, and hopefully they're going to, lower rates. I'm sorry, too slow to raise rates, and hopefully they're too aggressive to cut rates would be better. So I don't have the answer to that. They need to maintain their autonomy. At the same token, I think a little more communication, a little more collaboration would be better.
Donald Trump told Bloomberg Business Week that he'd like to keep Jay Powell on, which surprised a lot of people. It didn't seem like a real big fan. You think that's a good idea? If he's reelected?
That's out of my lane.
I finally found the
That's
sweet
way
spot.
out of my lane. Okay, I don't know. Not to say we don't think rates should have gone down earlier, but that's I don't know.
You'll take the Fed share you get, it sounds like.
Exactly.
Many thanks to Sterling Bay CEO Andy Gloor. What a fascinating look at the city that we're all getting to know all over again here. Kaylee, thanks for being with us.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate your time, sir. And of course, Andy, here with us. We are just guests in the city this week, along with tens of thousands of other people who are here in town for the Democratic National Convention.
50,000 for the convention. I think you can add quite a bit more when you consider the protesters who are in town here, Kaylee. We're going to see how this goes. We'll spend some time between now and the late edition of Balance of Power, check things out on the streets of Chicago, and let you know a little bit later on as we work our way up to Joe Biden's speech tonight. It does it from the Democratic National Convention for now. As I mentioned, we'll be back 5 p.m. Eastern. For Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for being with us on Bloomberg TV and radio.